They were identical in every measurable way. Two men born of the same blood, the same storm, the same cursed soil. And yet, in the winter of 1851, one clawed at his own flesh until his fingers split and bled, while the other sat staring into nothing, whispering about the walking specimens. For over 170 years, their story has been buried beneath layers of altered records, burned ledgers, and vanished witnesses. The Henderson twins, Thomas and Timothy, aren't just a medical anomaly. They're a crack in the facade of everything we've been taught about science, morality, and control. Because this was no illness, no madness, no tragic deterioration of the mind, as the official reports still claim. Something was done to them. Something powerful enough that the entire Medical College of Virginia, along with half the state's political elite, conspired to hide it. The deeper you follow this, the more you'll realize. The Henderson case isn't just about two men. It's about the origin of an agenda, one still shaping you today. And once you hear what was discovered inside Dr. Hartwell's coded notes, you'll never look at your own thoughts the same way again. The Henderson plantation sat on 800 acres of red Virginia soil, 12 miles east of Richmond, a place where the earth itself seemed to breathe secrets. The locals said you could plant a stick in that dirt and watch it grow into a tree, but the Hendersons planted something else entirely. By 1850, their fortune was legendary. On paper, it came from tobacco. In reality, tobacco was just the mask. Jeremiah Henderson, the twins' father, had discovered a far more lucrative trade, supplying anatomical specimens to southern medical schools. At first, it was subtle. When enslaved workers died of disease, Jeremiah sold their bodies instead of burying them. But soon, natural deaths weren't enough. He learned to preserve corpses using secret formulas, turning flesh into profit. And when the colleges paid higher for fresh material, the Henderson plantation became a silent farm for the dead. 3 barns on the property were rebuilt with hidden chambers. Wagons came at night. Bodies disappeared into the earth, their names replaced by forged documents claiming they'd run away. Thomas and Timothy grew up watching this. By 15, they weren't just witnesses. They were participants. They learned how to stop a heart without leaving marks, how long different poisons took to work, and which chemicals preserved the mind even after the body was gone. Their father called it science. But the twins would soon learn that someone else called it preparation. In the spring of 1850, a tall, angular man stepped off the train in Richmond, carrying a black leather case and a reputation already stained by whispers. Dr. Cornelius Hartwell, physician, theorist, and quiet exile from the Philadelphia College of Medicine. To the public, he was a pioneer. To those who knew the truth, he was something else entirely. Hartwell believed that human behavior could be engineered, not shaped by morals, not guided by free will, but tuned like an instrument. Criminality, obedience, rage, memory, even loyalty itself, all of it, he claimed, was chemical. And to prove it, he needed identical minds, perfect copies of the same biological blueprint. He needed twins. The Medical College of Virginia, young and hungry for prestige, gave him everything he asked for: a private laboratory, coded budgets, and living material delivered under the cover of night. The Egyptian building, with its shadowed halls and towering stone columns, became his sanctuary of forbidden science. By winter, Hartwell had discovered the Henderson twins, 2 wealthy, willing heirs raised in silence, already numb to human suffering. To him, they weren't men. They were instruments. But Hartwell's experiments didn't stop at altering thoughts. The rumors whispered among junior faculty claimed he was trying to split identity itself, to force one mind into 2 realities. It worked. And what he awakened inside the Henderson twins could not be put back to sleep. It was February 2nd, 1851, a night so cold the James River had begun to crust with ice. Inside the Henderson mansion, the oil lamps burned low. Then, a pounding at the front door shattered the silence. Jeremiah Henderson opened it and froze. Timothy stood there, completely naked, his skin mottled blue and purple from the freezing air. His hands dripped fresh blood, smeared halfway up his arms, and in his right fist he clutched a long-handled shovel. The blade was caked with dirt and fragments of bone and hair. His grey eyes, normally sharp and calculating, were blank, fixed on something Jeremiah couldn't see. Deep scratches crisscrossed his face and chest, as though he'd clawed through briar, or worse. When Jeremiah demanded an explanation, Timothy didn't blink. He didn't shiver. He didn't seem aware of the cold or the blood. He only repeated one phrase, over and over, each time quieter, flatter, more detached. "The specimens are walking." Minutes later, Thomas appeared, half-dressed, drawn by the noise. For the first time in their lives, he looked afraid of his twin. That night, Thomas followed his brother's trail through the frost to the drying barn. Inside, 3 enslaved men were seated at a wooden table, their bodies arranged with deliberate precision. Twigs forced their eyes wide open. Candles had burned down to stubs around them. It didn't look like murder. It looked like ritual. By the 3rd night after the barn incident, Timothy Henderson stopped sleeping entirely. He would sit motionless for hours in the darkened hallways of the mansion, whispering to shadows only he could see. Sometimes he'd point to empty corners and mutter, "Specimens." Walking, his cracked lips trembling like a man possessed. Other times, he'd smile faintly, as if sharing a private joke with something standing right behind you. The Henderson household tried to hide it. Jeremiah burned the blood-stained clothes, buried the 3 dead men in unmarked graves, and crafted a false story about escaped slaves. But secrets like these don't rot quietly. Because while Timothy collapsed inward, Thomas began changing too. He woke drenched in sweat, haunted by violent dreams that grew clearer each night. In one dream, he saw Timothy's hands crush a skull. He could feel the bones splinter under his own fingers. In another, he stood among bodies arranged in geometric patterns, watching Dr. Hartwell take notes by candlelight. Worse, Thomas's curiosity had turned into something darker. He began wondering, obsessively, what it might feel like to do what his brother had done. The twins had always been connected, able to sense each other's moods, predict each other's thoughts. But now, it was as though one mind was leaking into the other, carrying madness like an infection. Dr. Hartwell would later write in code a single chilling phrase about their condition. The experiment is no longer contained. Identity is splitting. 3 days after the barn killings, Dr. Cornelius Hartwell arrived at the Henderson plantation unannounced. He carried no medical bag this time, only a leather-bound ledger wrapped in oilcloth and locked with a brass clasp. Inside were his coded notes, later recovered in fragments from the ruins of the medical college archives. Deciphered by modern cryptographers, they reveal something terrifying. Hartwell hadn't been treating the Henderson twins. He had been rewriting them. His experiments focused on what he called cognitive partitioning, the idea that the mind wasn't a singular entity, but a network of identities, layered like sediment. With the right chemical triggers and controlled trauma, he believed one could force a mind to fracture, then rebuild it, piece by manipulated piece. Twins, he theorized, provided the perfect baseline. By destabilizing one, he could watch the other respond, creating a mirror experiment no ethics board would ever approve. Not that ethics existed here. One chilling line from his recovered notes reads, "Identicals present higher permeability. Identity itself is transferable." Timothy was the first subject. Thomas, unknowingly, became the control. But something went wrong. Hartwell's formulas, a cocktail of alkaloids, opiates, and untested compounds, didn't just split Timothy's identity. It opened a door. Timothy began speaking of things Hartwell never told him, knowledge from experiments Hartwell hadn't performed yet. It was as if something else was inside him, and Hartwell's private margin note scrawled in trembling ink said it all. Specimens are walking. By early March of 1851, the Henderson mansion had become a house of whispers. Servants claimed to hear footsteps pacing the upper floors long after the twins had fallen silent. Doors opened and closed in the night. Shadows stretched unnaturally beneath the oil lamps. Thomas Henderson was unraveling. He carried a hunting knife at all times, claiming he needed it for protection, though he never explained from what. When he slept, he woke drenched in sweat, sometimes gasping, sometimes laughing in his dreams. Worse were the night terrors. In them, Thomas wasn't himself anymore. Sometimes he was Timothy, feeling the cold bite of the shovel handle, the spray of warm blood. Sometimes he wasn't either twin at all. He was an observer, watching his own body move from a corner of the room, powerless to stop it. He confided in no one, not even Timothy, but the compulsion was growing. He had begun imagining the weight of the shovel, the sound of bone cracking under steel. He feared he might give in. And Timothy, he was drifting further from reality. He stopped answering to his own name. He'd stare at empty chairs as if people were seated there, muttering questions under his breath, and sometimes answering them. More than once, servants swore they heard two voices speaking when only Timothy was in the room. Hartwell wrote in his journal, "Subject demonstrates bilateral cognition, simultaneous streams of thought. Both are aware of each other, yet unaware of me. This exceeds design parameters." Whatever Hartwell had triggered, it wasn't just chemical. Something ancient in the human mind had been woken up. By mid-March, Dr. Hartwell moved his work into the Egyptian building, a looming stone structure at the heart of Richmond's medical college. Its dark columns were carved to resemble temple pillars, its design meant to evoke the mysteries of ancient knowledge. But what had happened beneath those cold floors was anything but sacred. Timothy was taken there under the guise of treatment. In truth, Hartwell was escalating the experiment. Servants later whispered about closed-door sessions where Timothy was strapped upright in an iron chair, his arms bound, his head locked in place. Hartwell introduced a series of compounds designed to push the mind past its natural boundaries. Timothy endured induced hallucinations, sensory deprivation, and electrical currents applied directly to the skull. The results were unnatural. After one session, Timothy began speaking in perfect, archaic Latin, a language he had never studied. He described visions of streets and buildings that matched the ruins of cities long vanished. Details Hartwell himself didn't recognize until years later, when archaeologists uncovered them in North Africa. Thomas, left behind at the plantation, began experiencing the same visions at the same time. He'd awakened choking on unfamiliar words, drawing symbols in charcoal that matched those Timothy had carved into the padded walls of Hartwell's chamber. 2 men, 1 experiment, but their identities were bleeding together. Hartwell's coded notes became frantic, no longer subjects, no longer mine, a shared field, crossing thresholds never meant to open. He had set something in motion he could no longer control, and that's when the deaths began. The first body surfaced on March 27, 1851. A junior physician at the Egyptian building, Samuel Griggs, was found in the basement archives, throat slashed, eyes wide open, and his fingernails packed with sand. No weapon was ever recovered, no footprints, no witnesses. 3 nights later, a student nurse was discovered dangling from a ceiling beam, her body twisted at an angle impossible for a self-inflicted death. The coroner's report vanished within days. By April, the whispers began. Staff claimed to see figures in the halls that dissolved when approached, doors slammed without cause, candles guttered in rooms with no draft. And then came the twins' connection. Thomas, still at the plantation, woke one night choking on blood that wasn't his own. He ran to the basin, coughing, only to find his reflection smiling back at him when he wasn't. Hours later, a rider arrived from Richmond. Timothy had suffered a violent seizure during Hartwell's experiments and bitten through his tongue. Hartwell, once so composed, was unraveling. His journal entries shifted from neat lines of code to scratched confessions. I have erred. I sought to divide, but they are merging. Memory no longer belongs to one. Dreams no longer theirs alone. Servants later testified that Hartwell began locking his study from the inside, terrified of his own patience. He confided in one colleague that he feared he had woken something older than humanity, something that used the twins as vessels. But he couldn't stop. He didn't dare. Because deep beneath the Egyptian building, in rooms no longer on any map, Hartwell had discovered proof that his theories were working, and the cost of that proof was about to spread far beyond Richmond. The first body surfaced on March 27, 1851. A junior physician at the Egyptian building, Samuel Griggs, was found in the basement archives, throat slashed, eyes wide open, and his fingernails packed with sand. No weapon was ever recovered. No footprints. No witnesses. 3 nights later, a student nurse was discovered dangling from a ceiling beam, her body twisted at an angle impossible for a self-inflicted death. The coroner's report vanished within days. By April, the whispers began. Staff claimed to see figures in the halls that dissolved when approached. Doors slammed without cause, candles guttered in rooms with no draft. And then came the twins' connection. Thomas, still at the plantation, woke one night choking on blood that wasn't his own. He ran to the basin, coughing, only to find his reflection smiling back at him when he wasn't. Hours later, a rider arrived from Richmond. Timothy had suffered a violent seizure during Hartwell's experiments and bitten through his tongue. Hartwell, once so composed, was unraveling. His journal entries shifted from neat lines of code to scratched confessions. I have erred. I sought to divide, but they are merging. Memory no longer belongs to one. Dreams no longer theirs alone. Servants later testified that Hartwell began locking his study from the inside, terrified of his own patience. He confided in one colleague that he feared he had woken something older than humanity, something that used the twins as vessels. But he couldn't stop. He didn't dare. Because deep beneath the Egyptian building, in rooms no longer on any map, Hartwell had discovered proof that his theories were working, and the cost of that proof was about to spread far beyond Richmond. On April 17, 1851, 2 black carriages rolled quietly into Richmond before dawn. They bore no markings, but the men who stepped out carried the weight of federal authority, agents from Washington, operating under orders Hartwell never saw. Within hours, the Egyptian building was placed under restricted access. Students and junior physicians were sent home. Records were seized. Guards patrolled the halls with rifles and bayonets. Hartwell wasn't arrested, but he wasn't free either. He was ordered to continue the experiments under their supervision. One of the agents, a severe man named Edmund Hale, asked Hartwell a single question during their first meeting. Doctor, if the mind can be split, can it also be rebuilt? Timothy was transferred to a sub-basement chamber deeper than the one with the inscriptions. Thomas was brought from the plantation under military escort. The twins were reunited for the first time in months, but they didn't speak. They simply stared at each other for hours. Neither blinked. Hartwell noted strange phenomena during their proximity. Temperature drops, flickering lamps, and metallic instruments vibrating on their trays as if exposed to a low, constant frequency. Worse, Timothy's predictions were growing more precise. He described Hale's childhood scar, hidden beneath his collar, and recited the exact phrasing of orders Hale had burned the night before. The agents were no longer merely observing. They were terrified. Hartwell overheard fragments of their whispered briefings. This matches the Philadelphia case. No public record, bury the findings. If it spreads, control collapses. But it was already spreading, because something inside the twins had begun reaching outward. By early May of 1851, the Egyptian building had become a sealed fortress. Guards were posted at every entrance. No one left, no one entered, and yet it still spread. It began with the orderlies. 2 men assigned to monitor the Henderson twins reported hearing voices in their sleep. Entire conversations in languages neither spoke. Within a week, both were found scribbling the same ancient symbols Hartwell had discovered beneath the building, their fingertips raw and bleeding from carving them into the walls. Then the physicians started breaking. One walked into the river at dawn and never resurfaced. Another was found sitting cross-legged in a hallway, murmuring, "I dreamed his dream, and he dreamed mine." Hartwell kept his journal in code, but even his notes couldn't hide his fear. The twins are no longer just linked, they are networked. Ideas bleed across flesh, across distance. Thought is contagion. Meanwhile, Timothy's body was deteriorating, hair falling out, skin graying, veins blackening, while Thomas's strength increased unnaturally. Hartwell realized, with mounting dread, that one was feeding the other. Agent Hale demanded results. Washington wanted to weaponize the process, to create soldiers who shared a single, unbreakable consciousness. But Hartwell warned them, "You cannot control what does not believe in individuality." The twins were no longer 2 people. They were becoming a singular mind, using 2 bodies as vessels, and somewhere in their tangled dreams, they were calling to others. That's when reports came in from the plantation. Workers were missing, entire families, gone. Thomas hadn't been there for months, but somehow he was still reaching them. By June 1851, Richmond had become a quiet quarantine zone, though no one dared call it that. Troops were stationed around the Egyptian building. Supply wagons arrived at night. Entire streets were sealed off, their residents relocated under vague federal orders. Inside, Dr. Hartwell's world was unraveling. The twins no longer behaved like human beings. They spoke in unison, even when separated by walls of concrete and iron. Their eyes tracked movements before they happened, pupils dilating in perfect sync. Worse, anyone who spent more than an hour in their proximity began showing symptoms, sudden bursts of knowledge they shouldn't possess, recurring dreams of spiraling symbols carved into black stone. A feeling of losing the boundary between self and other. Hartwell overheard Agent Hale confiding to another officer, "They've linked 6 orderlies already. We burned the bodies, but I'm not convinced it helps." Burned the bodies. The implication sank deep. Infection of thought couldn't be erased by fire. Hartwell pored through the inscriptions Timothy had translated, searching for a solution. One line haunted him. "To merge the vessels is to awaken the lattice." Was this all designed? Late one night, Hartwell found Thomas scratching patterns into the walls with his fingernails. When Hartwell tried to stop him, Thomas smiled and whispered, "You can't fight what you already are, Doctor." The next day, 4 guards stationed outside the twins' chamber walked into the woods and disappeared. None of them came back. Hartwell's notes ended abruptly that week with one sentence, "They are no longer contained within these walls." By July 1851, Richmond began to rot from the inside out. Families vanished overnight. Churches stood empty. Whole streets were silent except for the low hum that neighbors swore they could hear beneath the cobblestones. Authorities blamed fever outbreaks, quarantining districts one by one, but Hartwell knew the truth. The Henderson twins' consciousness had escaped the Egyptian building. It wasn't limited by walls anymore. It was moving through thought itself. Survivors described the same sequence of symptoms, an overwhelming sense of déjà vu, vivid dreams of a spiraling lattice, and whispers calling them by name. One man, raving in the market square before soldiers dragged him away, screamed, "They're building a single mind, and we are all just pieces." Hartwell finally confronted Agent Hale, demanding answers. Hale hesitated, then unlocked a chest containing documents stamped with the Great Seal of the United States. The Egyptian building, Hale confessed, was never intended to be a medical school. It was built atop older foundations, a site aligned perfectly with the Chesapeake ley lines. Beneath it lay a sealed chamber dating back thousands of years, its walls carved with the same spiral symbols the twins now drew in their sleep. Richmond was chosen, Hale whispered. Not by us, by them. That night, Hartwell descended into the lowest sub-basement, lantern in hand, following Timothy's translations. He found a stone door, one no human hand had opened in recorded history, and the hum was louder there. Behind him, Thomas and Timothy were waiting, smiling. "It's time," they said, in one voice. The stone door groaned like a living thing as it cracked open, releasing a gust of air so cold it burned Hartwell's lungs. His lantern flickered violently, casting jagged shadows across walls carved with symbols that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking. Beyond the threshold lay a circular chamber, vast and silent, its ceiling lost in darkness. In the center stood a black monolith, smooth as glass, humming faintly like a tuning fork buried deep in the earth. Thomas and Timothy stepped forward as if summoned. Their movements were perfectly synchronized, eyes reflecting the pale light like pools of oil. Hartwell shouted for them to stop, but his voice was swallowed by the room. Then the monolith responded. The hum deepened until it became vibration, rattling Hartwell's bones. Spiraling patterns erupted across the stone, glowing faintly, as if lit from within. He swore the symbols matched the ones Timothy had been dreaming for months. And then it spoke, not aloud, inside his mind. "The vessels are ready. The lattice will awaken." Hartwell collapsed, clutching his skull as images poured into him. Visions of cities built before memory, networks of minds interwoven like roots beneath the earth, and something vast sleeping beneath the Chesapeake Basin. Thomas and Timothy stood before the monolith, whispering in perfect unison, "We are not twins. We are halves." And with that, they placed their hands upon the stone. The hum became a scream, not of pain, but of birth. Above ground, every lantern in Richmond flickered out. The next morning, official records claimed there had been a fire beneath the Egyptian building, destroying all evidence. But those who survived whispered of something stranger. They dreamed the same dream. Every single one. By August 1851, Richmond was sealed off under martial law. The official story: a gas explosion beneath the Egyptian and building had triggered fires that consumed several blocks. Newspapers published diagrams and casualty counts. Witnesses were silenced or vanished entirely. But Hartwell's private journal, smuggled into a monastery in Maine before he disappeared, tells another story. He writes of waking up miles from the city, covered in soot, his ears still ringing from the monolith's scream. The Egyptian building was gone, reduced to rubble, but the humming hadn't stopped. It now came from beneath the river. The twins were nowhere to be found. Days later, an emergency session convened in Washington. Surviving members of the Richmond containment team were sworn to secrecy under a newly drafted directive, Executive Order 0987, a precursor to what would later become classified black site protocols. All artifacts recovered from beneath the Egyptian building were shipped to an undisclosed facility in Maryland. Every researcher, every soldier, and every doctor who had come into contact with the twins was reassigned, or quietly erased. But there's one detail the government couldn't contain. In the months that followed, identical dreams were reported as far north as Philadelphia and as far south as Charleston. Thousands described standing before a black monolith, hearing a single phrase in their minds: "The Lattice is awake." The Egyptian building was eventually rebuilt, its architecture preserved down to the smallest detail. Tour guides even brag about its mysterious Egyptian revival style. But ask the right person, in the right library, and you'll learn the building you see today isn't just a school, it's a seal. And if the hum ever returns, the Henderson twins, or whatever's left of them, will finish what they started. Some historians whisper that the hum has already been detected again, this time in Baltimore,